So now for our practical example showing Eine kleine Nachtmusik from Mozart. We have specified some instruments. We are still using the Cine Symphony Lite program that we used in the previous chapter. And as we know, this is a multi-instrument. So it has contrabass, cello, viola, and violin all accessible from one keyboard. But in my arrangement, I have 4 tracks, and I have specified these as the first violin, the second violin, viola, and cello. In fact, we are using the plug-in instrument in its default setting. There is a reverb included, and we are using the key switch setting, which is also the default setting. So it couldn't be easier to set this arrangement up. And now we can actually record the piece of music. So having played in a small section, you may have noticed that I slowed down towards the end, even though I am playing to a click. In my opinion, it is easier to perform the music to tempo, but if you need a retardando effect, in other words, slowing down, you can just play it, and later on you can adjust your metronome or click track to fit the music. Another option would be to define your tempo track in advance, and to follow the click. But this, in my opinion, would be less musical. In other words, when inputting the music, the dynamics and articulations, as well as the tempo variations, should be in the forefront. Now moving on, I come to a slight issue. In the first track, or the first violin, I was playing mainly quarter notes, dotted quarter notes, eighth notes, and a few 16th notes. The tempo of the piece is 120 BPM, and I managed to perform this without problem. The issue is that the second violin has a lot of repetitive 16th notes. And even if you are fairly fast on the keyboard, it is much more challenging than, for example, a violinist who can play with a bow and use the backwards and forwards motion. I have to trigger the keyboard for every 16th note, and this is quite challenging. Obviously, the solution to this issue is to slow the sequencer down somewhat. Now we could decide to play certain instruments in at full tempo, and only slow the sequencer down to insert the more demanding musical elements. But then we have the issue that we may lose the feel between the different parts. So it might be easier to find a tempo that suits our playing ability, and stick to that while playing the parts in. Of course, deciding on this tempo is somewhat important. If we go too slow with the tempo, then it will be difficult to play with any sense of musicality. And obviously, if we don't slow down enough, the sections may still be too demanding to perform. My solution is to find a tempo which is within my capabilities, but at the upper limit of what I can play. This allows me to keep the liveliness of the piece, but also perform the more challenging sections without error. So in this case, I will set the tempo to 90. One thing to consider is that mistakes are going to happen. You may insert the key switch too late, or you may play the wrong notes occasionally. But I would suggest continuing on rather than stopping and starting again. You can always go in and edit the odd error, but it is important to capture your performance rather than performing with a kind of stop-start approach, which will probably sound fragmented and lose the flow of the music ultimately. Of course, if you make many errors, it is best to stop and start again. But the odd small error is probably not a reason to stop, as you can edit them afterwards. So now I will record at 90 BPM. Now, if we go through and analyze my performance, there are certain things to point out, and these are mainly to do with dynamics. The tempo will be 115. In this section, I find it too loud. And here, just after the ritardando, once again I find it too loud. It should be quieter. Of course, here I could control the dynamics as I am playing the staccato sound. And then, at the end, just after the ritardando, I find the last note should be a touch quieter too. So to solve these issues, I now record over the performance with the modulation wheel to control the dynamics of the legato playing. The staccato playing will be untouched and will retain my dynamics that I played in. If I wanted to adjust the staccato dynamics, I would simply go in and edit the velocity of the notes. This form of editing is almost certainly available to you in any DAW. Now you have the option to edit straight away, or to play in the other parts now. My personal choice might be to edit first. The reason for this is that I have everything performed and edited correctly in the first track, and then when I play along to it, it will be much easier for me to play better, as I will be able to play along to the first track, knowing that the dynamics etc. are correct. Having said this, I still don't have a third hand with which to perform the dynamics using the modulation wheel on the legato sounds. So in this case, I will find it easier to play with the dynamics untouched on the first track, as otherwise they will be drowned out by the legato sounds on the new track I am performing. So once again, the choice is not as simple as it seems. It is a question of finding the right method depending on the situation. Now I want to play in the second violins, and these are somewhat more demanding. As mentioned previously, they have a lot of repeating 16th notes. And this shows up another slight problem that is present in certain libraries, or is more present in certain libraries. The Cine samples library seems to have this problem to a certain extent. And the problem is a slight delay before the sound plays. This isn't the latency of the computer system, however. This is an issue within the library itself. Now, for some people, they may not even notice this, but if you are very sensitive to timing issues, you will notice. The issue occurs now that I have to play 16th notes. As I have to play reasonably quickly, it is possible for me to slip out of my timing, as I don't hear the sound instantaneously. In the VSL library, this is somewhat less prevalent. This could be to do with the fact that the VSL instruments are drier and hence more direct. If I start playing in the second violins, you can see that I don't actually play them until the 16th note pattern appears. The reason for this is that I am using the same patch for the second violins as for the first violins, and in the previous chapter we discussed this. Playing the same melody on the same samples will in fact sound thinner, and will be flanged if we are unlucky. So I will simply add the sections that are not identical. You may also notice that the second violins are a touch quieter. This will help differentiate the two instrument sections. I'll start with the staccato key switch. And so, having played that in, you may have noticed that it was pretty much at the limit of my 16th note abilities. Here we can see and hear that I didn't quite hold the note long enough. But rather than play it in again, I will simply go into the editor and adjust the length of that note. So that wasn't a perfect performance, but we will keep it for now. There were no major mistakes and just some small timing issues, but nothing major. Now we move on to the viola. The viola also has some fast sections, so it's a good thing we are still at 90 BPM. One thing I can do here is play the first section simultaneously to the first violin. As this is an octave lower, I don't need to worry about any samples flanging or cancelling each other out. So having played the viola in, I'm going to edit a few errors that I noticed. Here at the beginning, the second note comes somewhat too early. So I'll simply move the note somewhat later from within the editor. As we get further into the piece, you will hear that there are a couple of sections where I play double notes, so I'll simply delete the wrong one. And there are a couple of sections where I'm not quite in rhythm. Another thing to notice is that as you add instruments, you tend to focus less on the click and more on the first violin. If we listen carefully to the click in this section around bar 11, you can hear that I shift from playing on the 1 to playing a bit later. This is because of the ritardando that I played in. If I wanted the click to be correct, in this example, I could simply add a beat somewhere around bar 11, and the click would then fall on the 1 again. There is no need to do this now, but it's the kind of thing that you might consider doing if you wish to keep everything neat and tidy as far as the metronome is concerned. Some people might consider going in and adjusting the tempo to fit the ritardando and accelerando sections. In our opinion, however, playing across the bar lines can help create a more natural feel to those sections. But once again, it is something that you will have to decide for yourself. For now, the only instrument missing is the cello. And fortunately, this is somewhat easier to play in. There are no 16th notes. I could choose to speed the tempo back up, but having got a feel for the music at this tempo, I will simply stick to 90 and play the cello in at this tempo. What I will do, however, is listen to the first violin, and use that as my metronome, rather than the click itself. Now that the cello has been played in, we can set the tempo back to, for example, 120 BPM. We will also mute the click. Now, having listened back without the click, the finer details of our timing are no longer issues. All of those slight variations do not really sound wrong. This is an important element of performing in a more classical style. You shouldn't base yourself around the beat and bars framework, as you would do perhaps in pop music. The tempo is more fluid and less rigid. Now we come to adding the modulation wheel control. And there is a cheat here. Obviously, to create the most realistic performance, we would add a modulation wheel for each track, controlling the legato playing dynamics. The reason this is important is that, for example, the first violin may play slightly more dynamically than the second violin. Having said that, the dynamic performance is fundamentally the same for the instruments, so I have a quick option, which is to select all 4 tracks and record one take of the modulation wheel. This simply saves me time, which in some cases is fine. Certainly, for getting a rough idea down, it is a perfectly acceptable solution, or cheat. Around bar 7, I bring the dynamics down a touch. Then I add a slight dynamic peak at bar 12, and then it goes back down. And from bar 21 on, the dynamics rise up again. And then right at the end, we get quieter. One thing I do after I have recorded the modulation wheel is to merge that data track by track by using the glue tool from my DAW. If I select modulation here, we get to just see the modulation data, and this makes it easy to edit. For example, this is the violin 1 track, so I could push the dynamics up a touch in relation to the other instruments. One thing I would do here around bar 13 would be to slow the tempo track down a touch. It sounds hurried, but there's no need to do it right now. And here, around bar 16, I want to tame the dynamics a touch. They seem slightly too loud. If I wanted to edit them now, I could redraw them, or I could record over that section with the modulation wheel. The score we used to play the music in from was specifically done to help us with key switches and the choice of staccato or legato playing. If you want to play the music in from an original score, you would have to decide which notes are played staccato and which are played legato. This is also something that can be interpreted differently by different musicians or by different conductors. So this could also be considered part of the skills that you will require when inputting music into the computer. Having listened back to the entire piece, we can say that it sounds pretty good. The 16th notes sound better than when they were played more slowly, and we don't notice any timing errors as much. If this was a pop production, and there was, for example, a drum track playing, then the timing issue may be more noticeable. In those cases, quantizing may not only be a solution, but also a desirable or necessary choice. Certain styles of music require everything to be synced to a beat and to be tight. But in this case, in my opinion, it sounds much like a string section should. So hopefully you have seen how important articulation is. In this example, we only used 2 articulation options, but we still managed to achieve a realistic string performance. So even if some people, for example on forums, say you need to use 4 or 5 different articulation options and have to play everything in at full tempo, etc., you don't really have to listen to that advice. The main thing is finding as simple a way as possible to achieve the results you desire. And so now we will do the same thing, but with the VSL library.